Moving over to video number 2 now, challenging the idea that gender is a spectrum. So, there is a tension between a claim that gender is not a binary, but a spectrum, which is what queer feminists argue, and a claim that only a small proportion of people can be described as non-binary. Because if gender is truly a spectrum, it should logically follow that we are all non-binary. Because by definition, binary is something categorical, either or. Spectrum is a continuum. So if there is a gender spectrum, pretty much, well, no one really would it, or only a very small minority of people. But this woman argues in this article that actually, when it comes to gender, no one is binary. So it's even more of a spectrum, say, than height, which is both binary and a spectrum. So we are all non-binary then. So that's the kind of logical conclusion that comes out of this. But obviously that's what queer feminists reject, which is a bit strange. So if we're all non-binary, then non-binary as a specific gender identity is absolutely redundant. I'm non-binary, you're non-binary, everyone's non-binary. Regardless of how feminine or masculine you might feel in terms of like your identification with gender gets applied to you by society and your affiliation with that, it doesn't matter. No one's 100% feminine, 100% masculine. No one is. You'd be an absolute, well, I guess that would be completely against the grain. That just doesn't happen. You know? No one's completely passive, no one's completely assertive, you know. Or it depends on the context and a whole host of other things. We have many different interests, they change over time. So we're all non-binary. So a proponent of a spectrum model assumes gender is both binary and a spectrum. At first glance, it does seem a little bit contradictory. However, it is possible for a property to be described as in both continuous and binary ways. For example, height. That's a classic example. Height is a continuum, but it's also a binary with tall and short. And at extreme ends of that continuum, you have extremely tall people and extremely short people. That's the binary, but they're only a very small minority of people. A really small minority, it would be the absolute extremes of height, or the absolute extremes of shortness for your age. If you have a bell curve, they would be like right at the ends. But that's a really small minority of people. Most people are somewhere in the middle. And in that middle zone, there's a non-binary height. Because you might describe yourself as tall, but it can only ever be relative, depending on the group you're with. So it's both a continuum and a binary. It's height. It's always comparative. No individual is absolutely tall or short. It's always relative to the average in some group. So perhaps those who cluster around the average might have claimed to refer to themselves as non-binary height. So if gender is also relative, then it flies in the face of insistence that individuals are the sole arbiters of their gender, because it is always relative to the gender identities in a particular group. So in a particular group, there could be someone else who's more feminine than you, and then you might feel comparatively masculine, but in another group, you might feel more feminine and so on, because it all depends on the people in the group. But when it comes to gender, absolutely nobody is pure masculinity and femininity, as I've already said. So she argues then, and I agree, but when it comes to gender, we are all non-binary. So she says, despite possessing female biology and calling myself a woman, biology, she's not a two-dimensional gender stereotype. She's non-binary. The word gender is not just a fancy word for your personality or tastes. Gender is a value system that ties desirable behaviour to reproductive function. Once we've decoupled these behaviours from reproduction and rejected the idea that there are just two types of personality, it means nothing to continue to call this gender. Instead, we need to call it personality. And she argues crucially that you can't slip through the bars in the current society that we live in on your own. So the non-binary position kind of occupies a kind of elite, kind of special snowflakey kind of identity where they claim they can slip through the bars because they're non-binary and get outside of gender, but no one's outside of gender in the system that we live in, because gender is oppressive. Everyone is within bars in the system that we live in. And kind of separating yourself from other people that you mistakenly call cisgender, as though they're somehow completely aligned with the value system of their society, and no one is completely, is kind of apolitical, because really we should be looking at society as a whole and joining forces, not artificially separating ourselves into camps like this. No amount of calling myself agender, she says, will stop the world seeing me as a woman, because she's a biological woman. And everyone will see her that way, no matter how she dresses, no matter what she does to her hair, no matter whatever. People will see her as a woman, because that's how she's sexed and that's how she is. People will see her like that. Gender is not a spectrum because it is not an innate essence. It's a socially constructed two-class system, but conformity to that two-class system will vary. That's where the variation is, and how much we conform to it, and how much we're willing to risk in not conforming. And that can change over time, and according to context. So gender is a value system. It says there are two types of personality. It would be a bit like saying that you're A class, so you're outside of a class system, which is also a value system, and no one's outside of a class system. You can rebel against your place within the class system, like try and aim for something that maybe others see as above your station. You can do that, but there could be repercussions, and as long as you're prepared to maybe deal with some repercussions, and there could be risks attached to it. And class is another value system that we want to abolish in the name of socialism, essentially. Well, that's what I want to anyway, in terms of aiming for more equality. But but class is similar to gender in that respect. It's not innate; it's something that's applied. People might behave in different ways according to their class, but again, that's not innate. That's class socialisation, and so is gender. Two types of personality. So one of the first steps of liberation is to challenge gender norms and to play with gender expression. She says men should feel free to go and wear dresses. Obviously, there could be consequences to that, maybe potential for being teased, depending on your age and other factors. But it's not against the law for a man to wear a dress. Or to paint his nails and things like that, and actually that's becoming increasingly common now. There have been shifts, major shifts. I often see men with painted nails and everything like that, so it is changing, and I often see men now wearing makeup, so I think things are becoming a bit more free, and that's just a good sign. Play with it, but the problem emerges only when we start demanding that others call themselves cisgender, and when we insist that these cis people have an advantage, and to insist that most stay in their boxes, will you identify as boxless. So the only people that technically have an advantage in our patriarchal society are basically if you're basically a reproductive male, so you're sexed male, that's your biology. You're a man, your sex is man, or male. Basically, you are at an advantage in that respect, but yeah, that's as far as it goes. So we mustn't reify gender. Okay, we mustn't reify gender. In other words, we mustn't turn gender into something essential. By insisting on more categories, that's ultimately what happens. We're reifying gender. Because human personality is complex, it can't be reduced. The solution is to abolish gender. Gender with two positions operates to continue the subordination of female to male. And creating a spectrum with ever more genders doesn't actually do anything to remedy that. It just carries on making out as though gender is something essential, and that most people are in boxes and are cis where no one's cis actually, because gender is not essential. And ultimately we're aiming for a world where everyone embraces their non-binariness. I guess it just depends how awake you are to the fact you're non-binary, really, because it's not essential. I'm non-binary, everyone's non-binary, you know what I mean? It's not a niche identity, it's just what everyone is. So yeah, we need to tear down boxes altogether. Hadley Freeman, by the way, wrote in a Guardian, also says the same thing, that we're all non-binary. You know, quite a few progressives argue this, by the way. For anyone who thinks this is not progressive, just go and check out the number of progressive people on the left who are arguing this. Radical feminists are actually quite left-wing by definition. In order to talking like this is quite a left-wing position. It's revolutionary, hence the name radical feminism. If anything, it's the queer feminists who, although they often claim to be progressive, are actually not as progressive as all that, because they still want to create these boxes. So yeah, and after all, like it actually becomes quite absurd. The more creating all these genders, we would have to create millions of genders, billions, in order to not to be oppressive, because every single person could have a different gender. You know, I could be fox gender, or I could be pizza gender. But why not just call it human personality or stuff I like? Why gender? There's no such thing as an innate identity, by the way, because we're humans, we change. Identity constantly changes. Everyone's fluid. By definition, everyone's gender fluid. Or personality fluid, we should technically call it. As I said, because gender's a construct. We use the word gender to what really should be personality. And it doesn't matter whether you're sexed, male or female, your personality should really be something that is, you know, constantly shifting, because it's not innate like your biological sex is innate. You know, it's different to that. Okay, so thank you for listening.